Over the past few weeks, a surprising amount of new information has quietly dropped for an upcoming indie game called Beta Decay, and the more you dig into these updates, the clearer it becomes that this isn't just another experimental indie project. This is a long-term systems-driven sci-fi RPG that's being built with a level of scope most people simply aren't aware of yet. What's important here is that this isn't old information. Between new developer posts, expanded answers on their Q&A pages, Steam updates, and behind-the-scenes explanations of how the world actually functions, we now have a much clearer picture of what Beta Decay is aiming to be. And it's significantly more ambitious than what its low-profile marketing might suggest. At a high level, Beta Decay is set in a collapsing sci-fi future where humanity has expanded beyond the Sol system, only to fracture under corporate control, political instability, and resource wars. That part isn't new. What is new is how the developers are framing the player's role inside this universe, not as a hero following a tightly scripted narrative, but as an active participant inside a living, hostile system that keeps moving whether you engage with it or not. Recent updates make it clear that the game's world is structured around interconnected megastructures, vertical cities, and industrial zones that are designed to feel oppressive, dense, and layered. According to the latest details, entire districts operate almost like ecosystems, with factions controlling resources, patrol routes shifting, and economic pressure shaping what activities are even possible in a given area. One of the biggest clarifications from recent developer answers is how player choice feeds directly into faction dynamics. This isn't a binary pick-a-side system. Factions compete with each other economically and territorially, and your actions can strengthen or destabilize them in subtle ways. Trading routes, sabotage, engineering support, information leaks. The game tracks influence in ways that go beyond mission completion, which means the consequences aren't always immediate, but they compound over time. Another major point that's been expanded recently is how Beta Decay handles roles and progression. You're not locked into a traditional RPG class. The new info confirms that your progression is tied more to what you actually do in the world. Spend time maintaining infrastructure or working with tech systems, and you naturally evolve into an engineering-focused character. Engage in combat operations or security contracts, and your capabilities shift in that direction. The idea is to let the player's habits shape their identity, not a menu choice made at the start. The developers have also gone deeper into explaining the survival layer, which is more integrated than it first appeared. Hunger, fatigue, environmental hazards, and disease aren't just meters to babysit. They influence how you interact with the world. Certain areas become inaccessible without preparation, specific factions may refuse interaction if you're visibly compromised, and prolonged exposure to hostile environments can permanently affect your character's performance if ignored. Another standout element from the newer details is how economy and scarcity are meant to drive conflict. There's a functioning player-driven market system tied to both physical locations and digital exchanges. What's interesting is that this isn't presented as a background feature. It's central to how power shifts in the world. If a region loses access to key materials, prices spike, crime increases, and faction behavior changes. The world reacts even if the player doesn't directly cause it. The updates also shed more light on space and vehicle systems, which until recently felt vague. We now know that starships aren't just transport tools. They're modular machines with internal systems, power routing, life support, data servers that can be upgraded, damaged, and even exploited. This suggests that space gameplay won't be isolated from the rest of the experience, but rather an extension of the same systemic design philosophy. Visually, the game's low polyvoxel style has also been contextualized better through recent explanations. This isn't a limitation, it's a deliberate choice to support scale, destructibility, and performance across large environments. The developers have emphasized that this approach allows them to simulate dense cities, massive interiors, and large player-driven changes to the world without sacrificing responsiveness. What's especially interesting is how much the developers are leaning into emergent storytelling. There is narrative structure, but it's not designed to funnel everyone through the same sequence of events. The newer Q&A responses responses suggest that many of the most impactful stories will come from systems colliding, faction wars escalating, supply lines collapsing, alliances forming and breaking. Community growth is another area where new information matters. The game already has a small but highly engaged player base, and the developers are actively shaping features around player feedback rather than locking systems early. This has led to several mechanics being reworked or expanded before early access even begins, which is usually a good sign for a long-term project. And looking ahead to 2026, the developers have been increasingly open about what the next major milestones will be. A full gameplay trailer is on the way, expected to finally show how combat, exploration, survival, and faction systems flow together in real time. That trailer is being positioned as a turning point. What makes Beta Decay particularly interesting right now isn't just what it promises, but how much clearer its direction has become through these new details. It's positioning itself as a slow burn, systems heavy sci-fi RPG that values depth over spectacle, player agency over scripted moments, and long-term world evolution over short-term content drops. This is still an indie project and expectations should stay grounded, but with the amount of concrete information now available and the consistency of development updates, Beta Decay is shaping up to be one of those games that grows quietly, then suddenly demands attention once everything clicks into place. For anyone interested in ambitious indie projects that aim higher than their budget suggests, this is absolutely one to keep a close eye on as it moves toward its 2026 release window. And this is where Beta Decay becomes especially interesting going forward. Based on the most recent updates and how openly the developers are now talking about long-term systems, it's clear they're not building toward a short early access novelty. They're laying groundwork for something that's meant to expand outward over time, both in scale and in complexity. New locations aren't just meant to be added as separate maps, but integrated into the existing economic, political, and faction systems, meaning the world is designed to grow rather than reset. One of the most promising signs is how much emphasis is being placed on consistency and internal logic. Combat ties into resource flow, survival ties into faction access, exploration ties into knowledge and leverage. That kind of interconnected design is hard to pull off, but when it works, it's what separates forgettable indie projects from games that develop long-term cult followings. There's also reason to be cautiously optimistic about pacing. The developers have been very clear that they don't want players to rush through content or solve the game quickly. Instead, progression appears to be intentionally uneven. Some paths are slow, some risky, some lucrative but unstable. Another reason to pay attention is the way Beta Decay seems positioned against larger sci-fi RPGs. It's not trying to compete on cinematic spectacle or hyper-realistic visuals. Instead, it's leaning into systems density, simulation, and player-driven outcomes, an approach that's becoming increasingly rare as budgets grow and risk tolerance shrinks. In a market full of safe, polished experiences, a game like this stands out simply by being willing to be uncomfortable and complex. For more on this game, drop a like on the video and subscribe to stay tuned.